Cassie. So Cassie, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll get going. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Data, Simplifying the Process. My name is Cassie Frost. I am an assistive technology specialist and former special education teacher, specializing in emotional and behavioral disabilities. So data has definitely been my thing. Before we go real far into this, I just want to let you know that it is storming outside. So if you hear any rumbling in the background, that is going on. And also, if you've ever been to anything that I present from this room, I also have a 13-year-old Basset Hound who occasionally decides that she's going to sleep behind me and snore. So if you hear thundering or snoring, I'm just kind of letting you know what those sounds are or maybe in the background today. So as we get going, the first question that I want to ask is how much time is wasted each day collecting data, documenting progress, and organizing information? I'm guessing for each one of you, this is something that happens pretty regularly. You definitely struggle with trying to find time to get all of the data that you need, or at the very least are looking for a new system or a way to make this a little bit smoother. So today we're going to look at a few of these things. We're going to talk a little bit about data. We are going to talk about collection methods. What are some ways to easily collect concrete data in your classroom? Different types of data, looking at some methods such as discrepancy analysis and observation. Go through kind of the process of determining what is a measurable goal. How do we make a goal that's truly measurable so we can get the data we're looking for? We're going to walk through Google Forms. We're going to start off with some real basic stuff, creating the form, putting in the questions, but more so we are then going to look at how can we set up the form in a way that we're going to get solid data that we can then take into meetings, or we can make some solid decisions about the students in our classroom. We're going to take a few minutes to look at Google Sheets, taking the data that we get from forms and looking at some things that we can do in Google Sheets to make the data a little bit easier to view. Sometimes Google Sheets can kind of be a lot to look through and gather information from. So we're going to get hands-on with a Google Sheet and make a few small changes to it and some formatting things so that you can easily grab the information that you want from Google Sheets. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about sharing results. So once you have this great data, how can you format it in a way that you can take into a meeting and everybody can easily see what it is that you are trying to get across? So as Deb said, if you have any questions as we're going through today, definitely put those into the question and answer box. I will definitely kind of stop here and there as I see those come in. If it's something that I'm going to be answering in just a minute or two, I may wait. But obviously, please, if you have questions, put them in so that I can make sure that I am addressing them. So my probably not favorite, but very close to it quote of all time. If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. And this is coming from Jim Barksdale, the former Netscape CEO. I think about this just about every time that I walk into any type of meeting that's going to be making a determination or a decision on students. Oftentimes, especially as a former emotional behavioral disabilities teacher, when you'd walk into meetings, obviously a lot of teachers and educators and administrators and parents have thoughts about what is best for the student, what's going well, how often are they coming late to class, how often are they turning assignments in on time, all of those things. Grades are a little more concrete, right? We can talk, are they passing these tests? Do they have this reading level? When you're talking about behavior, a lot of times opinions really come in. And that's really where my passion for this started. I'd walk into meetings and there would be a lot of conversation about, oh, well, I feel like he's getting to class more often than he was before. A lot of feel, a lot of thoughts. I think that. And unfortunately, every single one of us have a different experience with a student. So if we're talking about behavior, depending on the time of the student's day that we interact with them, depending on the time of day that the students in our classroom or the subject matter, we only have very different experiences with a student. So when we're tracking things like getting the class on time or number of times the student interrupts or other behavioral factors, there's a lot of opinions that come in and we may all have very different ones because we all interact with the student at a very different time. So I began to kind of sit down and figure out how can we do this in a way that we actually have some data? Because again, if we all have opinions, we may as well go with mine. right? I'm right. And I'm guessing everybody else at that table is also thinking the exact same thing. So now is the time we're going to spend some time looking at data. How can we create forms, methods, routines, systems that make data easy to collect, save us time in the end, and have us walking into meetings with more than just an opinion? So, a couple of big questions. First off, why do we collect data? What's the purpose in general? Oftentimes in a school, we collect data because we need it for report cards, we need it for grading, we need it for state reporting, right? We may also collect data just because we want to know how a student's doing. If we work in the special education field, we also collect data to track progress towards IEP goals. So there's a lot of reasons that we decide we want to collect data. Most often we're collecting that data because we want to know how a student is doing. We do pretty good with that. The next section, though, is what do we do with the data we collect? This gets a little bit iffier depending on the data that we're talking about. Oftentimes, if we're collecting data on a student's reading scores, we know where that student's at, and we're going to make some decisions about how we can help them progress further with their reading skills. When it comes to some other things, such as behavior or progress on a certain subject, we might not always have that next step of follow through. We might not do as much with the data as we would like to. When I talk with teachers, the number one reason that occurs is because the data is not easy to work with. Or more often and less helpful is that we collect data, but it's not collected in a way that is concrete. Okay. If we collect data and we don't take the time to collect it in a very concrete manner, it really isn't much more than an opinion because it's getting collected at certain times of day. The questions are kind of iffy. There's some, how do you feel about this type questions? So we need to figure out what can we do with the data and how can we set up the data so that we can actually make some solid decisions regarding students about this. So a couple of different ways that we can collect data. Oftentimes, the two that we're going to look at most frequently, almost every type of data collection is going to fall under one of these, either observation or testing. So observation is going to be something we do all day, every day. Right? We know what time students get to class on time. We know how students are doing with reading. We know if there are this many behavioral incidences. These are all observations. Then we also have testing. So these may be our MAPS tests, our state tests, our standardized tests, our building tests, our screeners, our KTEAs, our Woodcock-Johnsons. Those are all of our tests, right? As a whole, if you're working with a testing situation, you typically have a pretty formal way to collect that data. There's definitely different protocols that go with testing. There's a way to document the results of it. And the data is usually a little bit more concrete at the end. Those testing scores often get shown up in IEPs, in meetings, at the district level, etc. Then there's the observation. This is collected in more informal ways. So this is maybe you keeping a tally sheet on your desk. This is you observing how often a student gets to class on time. Those are going to be more informal, but not less valid. So both of these should be documented so you can learn from what you've collected. If you observe, but you don't document it, your view is going to be skewed at some point. So my example of this, and I'm going to keep kind of going back to this class on time thing, just because I think it's something that every student experiences at some point. Every teacher works with students who are a little bit later getting where they need to be. So it's a great example. So if we're talking about a student getting to class on time, if the student is doing really well at getting to class on time, maybe they're only late once a week, right? Once a week out of like 40 classes, that's pretty good. But then all of a sudden, something kind of changes. They've been doing really well for like 6 weeks. And then all of a sudden they're late like 2 times a day for like 3 days. And then they start getting a little bit better. And the meeting is right after that. What's most frequent and recent in our minds is that most recent event. So we're going to remember the times that the student has been late, and we're more likely to walk into that meeting saying, the student has really been late a lot lately. And we're not going to pay attention to the fact that over the course of 9 weeks, their attendance was actually quite a bit better than that. So again, even if you are doing observations, that data should be documented as much as possible. So when we're talking about observation, there are obviously a few different ways that we can collect data. And I want to talk about a couple of those today. One of the first things that people do when they are doing observations, they're collecting data, is they might write down notes. Or they may make a tally sheet, right? A Post-it notes, one of my favorite things. I've got Post-its everywhere, right? So maybe you make a tally every time a student blurts out, or you make a tally every time that a student stumbles over a word while they're reading. Okay, and that's definitely that observation, informal data collection. But there's also another method of more observation-based data collection called a discrepancy analysis. And I want to take a couple minutes to go over this just because the data is collected a little bit differently and it's worked with a little bit differently. So discrepancy analysis is simply a method of observing a student that compares the student's actions to that of their peers. So oftentimes, if you are observing a student and wanting to see how they're doing in a classroom, right? So this is usually a little more behavioral again, and I'm going to get into more some of the academic stuff, but this one's a little more behavioral. So when we walk into a classroom and we're observing students and we're watching students in our own classroom, it's pretty easy to determine that a student isn't listening to the teacher. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? But that kind of negates everything else that's going on around the student. It may be that there's a bunch of students who aren't listening to the teacher. It may be that the directions weren't super clear. So a discrepancy analysis is going to compare students to everybody else around them instead of, are they doing what the teacher said? So this one's going to provide data for discussion. It's not as like graphable as some of the other ones we're going to talk about, but it still is concrete data. So here's an example of a form, and this is modified from WCSD Assistive Technology Department. This is the discrepancy analysis sheet that I will typically use when I go into a classroom. However, you can simply do this with a line sheet of paper. The important part are the 4 columns. So when you go in and you are looking at how is the student doing during class, and this may be before an IEP meeting, this may be if you are getting some behavioral reports from a student, this could be looking at an assistive technology evaluation. You know, is the student able to participate the same as their peers? So the very first thing you're going to do is you're going to document what are the students doing? Not your student, what are all of the students in the classroom doing? So maybe the students are supposed to be reading a book, but maybe they're kind of talking. So what are your students doing? Take a moment and you're going to write down there kind of just a sentence, a few words, a phrase. What are the students doing? Once you've done that, you're then going to take a minute and you're going to look at your target student. Is your target student doing the same things as everybody else? So if everybody is getting their book out for reading, is your student also doing that? If yes, put a plus. If no, put a minus. Next to that then, if your student got a minus, if they're doing something different, what is your student doing? It's that simple. You're going to go to the next row. That last column you're going to ignore for now. So then when the students move on and now maybe they are reading. So you're going to say most students are reading, 3 or 4 are looking around the room. Is your student doing this? Yes or no, plus or minus. If they're doing something different, what are they doing? And you're simply going to observe your student doing this. After the observation, after that time, you're going to sit down yourself and kind of reflect, and maybe the teacher that was in the classroom, or if it was your classroom, or the team, and you're going to sit down and say, okay, what can we do about this for these minuses? The times that the student that I'm talking about, or I'm looking at, my target student, the times that they're doing something different, how can I help them do what everybody else is doing? And that's what we're going to look at. Do we want to teach? Do they not know what they're supposed to be doing? Do we need to teach them? Do we need to assist them? Do we need somebody in the classroom that's going to prompt them or assist them through doing it? Or are you going to adapt the lesson or adapt the activity to make it easier for the student? I'll give you a hint in this example. You're always going to look at teach, then adapt, then assist, kind of in order. You always want to be able to let the student be as independent as possible. But again, this is a very formal way to be able to document how a student is doing in class compared to their peers, if they're doing something different, and then to be able to bring to the team and say, okay, in these instances, the students were doing these activities. my target student, your student wasn't doing these things. What can we do to help support them? And bring this solid data into a meeting. So while this data looks a little bit different, it's not numbers, it's not graphable. It also is giving you a concrete something that you can bring to a team and say, okay, we need to look at this. And here's what's happening. So again, I wanted to bring this up first just because we are going to spend a lot of time looking at things that can be graphed and kind of quantified a little bit more. But I wanted to show an example of something that is a little less quantifiable in numbers, but still keeping track of that solid data. And this can be done on computer or on paper. It's super simple, super easy. Again, you can make yourself a fun form like this, or you can just use a line sheet of paper. What's the class doing, plus or minus? If your student's doing something different, what are they doing? After the fact, you're going to go back and look at those minuses and what you can do to help support the student. I just had a question. Are you willing to send this form to us? Absolutely, I can link it into this. And Deb, I'm guessing that you can also send that out, but absolutely, I can make a copy of that.
If you send me the document, I'll add it to the PDF that will be sent out tomorrow.
Perfect. I absolutely can do that. Okay, then I also want to talk about another collection method, and this one is my favorite. So this one's paper clips. So when we start talking about data collection, we're thinking a lot of high-tech things. We're talking some really involved systems. We just talked about a piece of paper. That's awesome. My next favorite are these things, okay? Just your standard paper clips. The reason I like these for data collection, so I said earlier, a sheet of paper and a Post-it note and a pencil, right? To keep track of tallies. There's a couple of problems that come into this. One, you might not always have a piece of paper nearby. Two, pencils tend to walk off, right? Students need to borrow them and suddenly you don't have one anymore. Three, students can see it, right? They know that you're writing something down. It makes students nervous. Somebody walks over and says, what are those tallies for, right? There's a lot that can go into trying to write something down on a piece of paper during class. However, if I instead take a handful of paper clips, right? We all have them, right? Just collect them off of assignments as you hand out papers during the day. You'll have a whole handful. Put them in one of your pockets. Make sure on the day that you want to take a sample for data that you have a pair of pants or dress or something that has pockets, 2 of them. Put a handful of paper clips in one pocket. Necessarily doesn't matter how many, just a good number of them. If you're tracking, maybe, for example, again, we're going to talk blurting out. How often a student is interrupting or blurting out during class. As class is going on, that student blurts out, you simply take one paper clip out of one pocket, switch hands, and put it into your other pocket. It's that simple. Most students just kind of think you're fidgeting, right? I like paper clips for fidgets, so most students think that's all you're doing. But in reality, you're keeping track of how often something happens. It doesn't distract from your students. It's not something that you visually have to look at. It's not something even that you have to break your stride of teaching to do. Okay. Can you do it with other things? Absolutely. You could do this with, little colored chips, lots of other things. The reason I like paper clips is because they're cheap. They're already in our classrooms and they're kind of unobserved by students, right? They don't care. They're paper clips. So no one really notices what you're doing. Okay. Unless you make a really big show out of trying to dig it out of your pocket, but I haven't had too many people do that. So my point of showing, especially the paperclip thing, is there's a lot of easy ways to collect the data other than I feel like, or I think this is how often this is happening. Okay. It can be as simple as a paperclip. Okay. Well, I got to click in the right spot. So types of data that we're going to look at today and types of data that we collect. There's academic data. So these are our reading scores, our math scores, our AP tests, all of the things that our students are doing academically. And we do this pretty regularly. There's a lot of systems in place for this. Then we may be collecting behavioral data, right? And this happens sometimes when students are a little bit younger. A lot of report cards have things on how often is the student, paying attention, sharing with their peers, etc. Then we collect IEP data, right? For those of us who work in the special education field or work with special education students, we collect data all the time on IEP goals because we need to be able to walk into a meeting and say, here was the goal for the student. Did they meet it or not? And where are they at on that process? Also, sometimes we want to collect social data. If we are working with a student who is struggling with social skills, We may want to be looking at things like how often do they initiate play with their peers? How often do they initiate a conversation? When there's group work, how often is the student initiating finding a partner? Okay, so some social data. So we have all these things we want to look for, right? We know we need to keep track of these things. We want to be able to walk into meetings with really solid data. We've got some ways to keep track of it, right? We've got discrepancy analysis. We've got tally sheets. We've got paper clips. We can use all sorts of things to gather information. But what if our goal isn't measurable? Okay, we're really good at saying this student needs to be able to do this, right? All students should be in class on time. Students shouldn't blurt out during class. We kind of know what we're looking for, but we have to be able, if we're going to collect solid data, we need to be able to come up with a measurable goal. And can that goal be quantified? Is there a solid answer, not an I feel answer, right? So I'm trying to think of a really good I feel. So if the goal would say something like, student A will participate more in class. Okay, student A will participate more in class. The question to that would be, did student A participate more in class? Right? I'm always going to frame that as a question. So I have the goal, frame it as a question. Does that student participate more in class? Is there a solid answer to that? Do we have numbers? Not really. We have an I feel, right? I feel like they're participating more. So once we've kind of reframed that, so is the student participating more in class? Okay, let's look at that goal again. So maybe instead of saying the student will participate more in class, we're going to say student A will participate more in class by answering questions when asked in 3 out of 5 opportunities, right? So now we have 3 out of 5 opportunities when they are directly asked a question. Okay, so now let's ask the question. So student A will participate in class by answering questions when asked 3 out of 5 times. What's the question? Does student A, or how many times does student A answer the question or answer when asked a question? Right? There's our question. Is there a solid answer? Well, yeah. How many times is the student answering a question when asked? Okay, we've got an actual answer. We've got a number. It's quantifiable. Is the test to answer the question repeatable? So can you do this multiple times? It can't be just a one and done thing. It can't be, okay, well, this one day I'm going to ask them to answer, but then I'm not going to ask them a question in class again for 5 or 6 days. It's not repeatable. Whatever the question is, or the test to answer the question about the goal, right? So I'm kind of going in phases here, right? We've got a goal. There's a question that you can answer to see, are they actually doing this? If it's a solid one, can you do it over and over and over again? So can you be regularly testing this? So whether that's academically, whether it is paper clips and blurting, how often are you going to check to see how this goal is going? It has to be repeatable, not a one-time thing. So let's look at an example. Sally will improve her reading skills by 1 year. I've seen this in IEPs. Okay, I've seen this written out in team goals, 504 plans, team meetings, grade level. Sally will improve her reading skills by 1 year. Okay, our question for that would be, is Sally improving her reading skills by 1 year? Well, at the 1 year mark or by the deadline, we could probably test and see if she's made it a year, but along the way, we really have no idea how she's doing, right? If somebody asked me after a month, is Sally improving her reading skills by 1 year, at the end, I'm going to go, I feel like she's making progress. I feel like she's getting there. I feel like it's going well. Probably not our most measurable goal. Instead, we could say Sally will improve her reading skills by reading a 3-paragraph passage at the 4th grade level with a minimum of 3 errors in 4 out of 5 instances. Ooh, okay. Well, now we know what she's reading. We know she's reading a 3-paragraph passage at the 4th grade level. Okay, great. That is maybe the end goal. At 1 year, we want her to be able to do this. Awesome. With a minimum of 3 errors maximum. That should probably be maximum, right? There's a typo in there. A maximum of 3 errors in 4 out of 5 instances. Okay, well, 5 is a great number because there's 5 days in a week, right? So for an educator, most weeks, that'll work pretty well for me. So maybe every day we're going to have her read a 3-paragraph passage and document how many errors. So the question would be, when Sally is reading a 4th grade passage, 3-paragraph 4th grade passage, how many errors is she making? And so in our results, we're just going to tally. Today she made 6 errors. Today she made 2 errors. Today she made this many errors. When we're done with that, we can figure out in our time period out of 5. So we're going to kind of do some figuring here, right? To do, comparable fractions. But even in a week, you could say, okay, this week she hit the goal 2 out of 5 times. Well, she's on her way. Next week, maybe it's 3 out of 5 times. And we can tell that she's making progress towards that goal. Kelly, I see you in the question and answer there. I hear educators say, I think they are doing better. Yeah, that's definitely wording that I hear frequently. And it's very well-intentioned teachers. It's teachers that are phenomenal at their job and educators that really want to work with students, but they haven't figured out yet exactly how to make their data concrete. Okay. Here's another example. Billy will improve the rate that he gets to class on time. Okay. Can this be phrased as a question? Has Billy gotten to class on time? Well, kind of, right? That kind of is a question. So Billy will improve the rate that he gets to class on time. Has Billy gotten to class on time? Well, yes or no. It doesn't really show us over time. We'd have to track this probably every day. It's not super measurable. Let's look at some rewording. How about how many days this week did Billy get to class on time? Okay, well, now we've got kind of this concrete. We've got that it's in a week. We know how many days. Okay, how many days this week did Billy get to class on time? So now let's rephrase the goal. So sometimes if your goal, you're not really sure how to make it measurable, come up with a question and then look back at the goal. So if we changed, did Billy get to class on time, to how many days this week did Billy get to class on time? What goal could go with that? Billy will increase his rate of getting to class on time by arriving on time to class at least 35 out of 40 class periods. I picked that because there's in the district I'm thinking of, there's 48 hours, 8 periods in a day, 5 days in a week, 40 class periods, right? Make your math as easy as possible. So this can help us come up with a goal that truly is measurable. If we start thinking about how can we track this? How can we measure this? If you can come up with a solid question, then look back at the goal. So if you start with a goal, you're not coming up with a solid question to check in on it and see how it's going. Rethink that question and then go back to the goal. So this is important. Data is data. Okay. It doesn't matter whether it's academic or behavioral, the systems remain the same. So as we go through what we're going to go through next, this is the important part. It doesn't matter what you are tracking. You can be tracking how often the post office delivers your mail on time. You could be tracking how often my basset hound snores during a presentation. You could be talking about how often a student knocks things off of other people's desks. You could be talking about how often a student makes errors during a reading passage. It doesn't matter. Data is data. So once you figure out the systems, they're going to be ready to go however you use them. As we talk about these next couple things on how we're going to track the data, right? So we've been talking about what data do we want? How do we word the questions? And we're going to kind of go back through that a little bit as we keep moving forward here. But now we're going to talk about systems. How can we document? How can we keep track of data? Because if we have a pile of Post-it notes sitting around, or we, just jot down how many paper clips are in our pocket, after 2 or 3 weeks, we've got all of this information sitting around, but what are we going to do with it? How can we look at it? So we're going to talk about what we can do next. We have all the data. Now what? But it's important to recognize that the first time you use these systems, they may take longer than what you're used to. And I always like adding that little caveat in here. The first couple of times that you utilize these systems, they're going to take longer than what you're used to. Once you are familiar with the systems, once you've got the steps in place, You then can use them in multiple scenarios with minimal changes, and it's going to save you a ton of time. So this is a time-saving thing, even though as I show you, it may be like, wait a second, this is going to take me a while. It will at first. It's going to take you a little bit of time at first. I always like being upfront with that, especially at the beginning of the year, because everybody, we're tight on time, let's be honest. But over time, once the systems are in place, once you have the routines down, once you have your initial forms created, it's going to save you a lot of time again and again and again. And it's going to save you from walking into meetings and go, well, I feel like. Okay, so we've written measurable goals. We've determined how we're going to collect, whether that's paper clips, whether that's a discrepancy analysis, whether that is a tally sheet, whether it's a test. But now how are we going to track it? I love this picture over here. I picked him because I think I've gotten that look, right? When I start talking about tracking methods with teachers, I'm pretty sure I've seen that look. I'm pretty sure I had that look when I started doing this. So never fear, we'll get you there. So we're going to spend some time initially looking at Google Forms. Now, there are a lot of different ways to collect data. Google Forms is not the only one. However, with so many districts being Google districts and working with Google Drive now, I like showing Google Forms because it's a fairly easy way to create a data collection system. And it's something that, teachers are pretty familiar with. So we're going to work with Google Forms. So when you're going to start working with Google Forms for data collection, first thing you want to do is map out your questions. I wouldn't, unless you're really super familiar with forms, I wouldn't spend a lot of time putting them into the form until you know what types of questions you want. So think about what you're collecting data on. Is it a behavioral goal? Is it an academic goal? What are you actually collecting data on? Once you've done that, you've written out some questions, then I want you to think about what cues you might need when you're in a hurry. So again, if we're looking at the goal for student A to be to class on time, right? So our goal is student A will arrive to class on time in 4 out of 5 instances, right? We can put that goal into a form, but most of our brains, when we're in a hurry, aren't going to look at that and figure out exactly how we're going to answer it. So student A will get to class 4 out of 5 times, right? He'll get to class on time 4 out of 5 times. Great. But if our answers are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in a hurry, you might think, well, I'm supposed to click how many times he got to class on time, or maybe I'm supposed to click how many times he was late. And all it takes is you entering it in once or twice wrong, and your data is going to be all messed up. So when you're in a hurry, how can you create a form that's going to make it easy for you? So instead of writing down the goal, what I'm likely going to do is write out the goal, and then I'm going to give myself some help text. I'm going to say, student A will arrive to class on time 4 out of 5 instances. And I'm going to give myself some help text. I'm going to actually say, how many times did student A get to class on time this week? Okay. I'm going to word it in a very comfortable way, less IEPE goal. That's a new word. I'm going to make it less formal and something that when I'm in a hurry, it's the end of the week. I know I need to do this. It's not going to stop me because of lack of time. Okay. Then I need to determine how frequent do I need to complete this form? Well, if it's to class on time 4 out of 5 instances, so maybe it's 4 out of 5 days in the week, I'm going to complete this form every week. So I'm going to keep maybe tallies on my desk, or I'm going to use an online system. And at the end of the week, I'm going to enter in how many times student A got to class on time. Perfect. It's weekly. I'm not doing this every period. Once a week, I'll sit down and do it. Then you're going to go in and create your form. Then you are going to test your form. Okay. And that's going to be really important. I'm going to walk you through those steps. We are going to do a demo of it. I'm going to walk you through the steps of doing it, but I do want to share a couple of tips first. So the first thing before you create your form, sketch out the order of your questions. Okay, what question? I'll give you some examples in just a second. Sketch out the order of your questions so that as you are typing into your form, when you create a Google form, a spreadsheet's being created. So if later on you've put in some examples, you're starting to do it and you decide the questions just aren't great, the spreadsheet is going to stay the same, even though you're changing the form and the questions. So take some time, figure out the order of your questions before you go anywhere else. Tip 2, try your form before finalizing it. Create a Google form, put in your questions, put in your goals, put in all of your information, and then take a minute to send it to yourself and enter in some fake responses, or maybe find a friend that's willing to do it for you. But put in some fake data and see what graphs and information you get at the end. Different Google form types of questions, so like multiple choice versus check boxes, all of those kind of create different graphs for you at the end. And there's definitely times where I've had a teacher who's done just an amazing form, but didn't end up with the data in a format that was usable at the end. So definitely fill in some fake responses, see what the data looks like on the end, and make sure that it's solid before you commit to this is how I'm going to use this. Okay. So some examples: tracking individual student behavior data. So maybe a student has behavioral health concerns during the day, staff member witnesses the event, fills out a Google form, the inform's embedded on a website, they document the date, the time, the staff involved, the nature of behavior. Takes less than 30 seconds. Every time that there is a behavior concern, a staff just simply opens up the Google form, clicks the date, the time, who was involved, what was the behavior, they're done. The data is collected. I will tell you, when I was in the classroom, this was kind of my favorite form. I had a 4-story building and worked with students with some behavioral difficulties on the junior high level. I think all students in junior high have some form of behavioral struggle some days. But oftentimes at the end of the week, I would hear, oh, so-and-so had a really rough week. Okay. And the next week, so-and-so had a really rough week. And so then I'd finally sit down and say, what's actually going on? And I wouldn't have known how often things were happening, because somebody's saying somebody's having a bad week or a good week. It's another one of those very nebulous changing things and very opinion-based. So I didn't really know what was happening. So I created a Google form that actually our educational assistants had embedded on a device. And anytime that they had to pull a student out of class, whether it was just to talk to them in the hall, to take a walk, anything that kind of disrupted the normal, they would just go ahead after the student was back in class. They would open up the form, put in the date, the time, who was involved, what happened. So I pulled the student into the hall. We talked for a couple of minutes. They returned to class. Or so-and-so was in the hall. We had to walk around for 15 minutes. And then here's what the follow-up was. And now at the end of the week, I could look back and easily see how many times was that student truly out of class. Because in a junior high 8-period day, they worked with different educational assistants throughout the day. There was really no way of knowing how often that was truly happening. And now all of a sudden I have this solid data showing how often is that student out of class? How quickly are they returning to class? Cameron just asked that this slide was not in the notes. This one was not. It was something that was added after the fact as part of demonstration. When I send the forms and stuff to Deb, I will include this. You will get the updated then. All data is automatically placed into a spreadsheet. The data within the spreadsheet can be filtered by student, type of behavior, location, etc. We can also look at academic data. So a unit has essential learning targets used for formal, informal assessments. Form is created for that unit of study. Teacher has access to the form on the computer or mobile device, can do quick check-ins. That data is put into a spreadsheet. And now that data can be used to group students, accelerate instruction, provide remediation. Super simple. How are your students doing? So here's an example. If I were going to do a behavior form, these might be the questions that I wanted. And like I said, I decided to kind of put these in kind of last minute here. I'm going to walk through them, but I also wanted to add it in here for you. So if you were going to create a behavioral form, maybe your first question is going to be the date, the time the behavior started, the student name. So maybe you're going to keep track of a lot of students on this form. So which student are we talking about? What was the type of need? So was it a bathroom break? Was it a medical check? Was it a behavioral thing? What was the need? Maybe it was a earned break or a requested break. What time did it end? So how long did this entire incident happen? What staff member was involved? This is really interesting because sometimes students end up with more of certain types of behaviors when they're with certain staff members, right? Maybe they feel more comfortable around a certain staff member to ask about a medical condition, or maybe they know that a certain staff member is better during a break time. Where did the incident occur? This is great. Now I can start tracking, keeping track. Was this behavioral incident, are they typically happening in the library, in the hallway, during a specific class? And then a possible motivation. This is usually where I wanted the educational assistant to kind of say, what do you think is going on? Is this to avoid class? Is this when they're asked to read? Is this when they're feeling embarrassed? What do you think the motivation for this event was? Okay. So again, just kind of an example of what you could possibly kind of outline in a behavioral form. For an academic form, I see I left behavioral up there. Maybe you're going to have the date. What was the learning target? What are we checking on? Can they do? So this is maybe a sample of how well they know the parts of a cell. I would fail right now, but so maybe the learning target is, the number of times they, the parts of the cell that they know. What's being used to assess the skill? Okay, so maybe that's going to be, I'm just going to kind of call each student up and point to parts and see if they know them. And then I'm going to say student A, and how are they doing? So did they get 3 out of 5 parts of the cell, 5 out of 5 parts of the cell, etc. And so then I can mark that on there. At the end of class, then I can go in and see how we're as a whole, all of my students doing on knowing the parts of the cell. Okay, so again, just a quick, easy way to see that in the end. Okay, before we jump into Google Sheets, I want to jump out of this presentation, and we are going to take just a minute to actually work with a form. Okay, so in order to create a form, you're going to go into File, New, and Form. Okay, you can do that from your Google Drive. You can do that from any one of the products. Once you have your new form, it is going to come up and look like this. So let's go back to our example of maybe class on time. So we're going to say that student A maybe has 2 goals. I'm going to think IEP goals because that's just where my brain goes. So I'm going to say the student has 2 goals. It's going to be getting to class on time and participating. Those were both examples we used. So I'm going to name this form, something that I can remember. Okay, so student A, I would probably use the student's name. I'm going to say for quarter 1, because I'm going to keep track of this over the course of a quarter. And then I will duplicate this for quarter 2, but that way when I'm kind of tracking my data at the end, I can kind of break up how they did in each quarter. And my form description, I'm going to say maybe that these are IEP goals and the beginning date to the end date of the IEP, just because that helps my brain. Okay, I'm all about things that help my brain. So, okay, we have a student. Now we need to know, when is this form being filled out or for what time period, right? So because we're looking at weekly, okay, this isn't a behavior incident. A behavior incident, we'd want the date right away. I'm going to say week. Okay, I just want 1 week. And I am going to do a multiple choice, okay, or drop down, because I don't like, drop down means they're going to all kind of hide, so I don't have to see them all at once. So this was going to be week 1's reporting, week 2's reporting, 3's, 4's, 5, 6. Oops. I decided it was going to change my formatting. Okay, so we've got 9 weeks, right? In a quarter, it's 9 weeks. So I'm going to give 9 weeks. So now I'll know how the student is doing week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. Okay. And so I'm going to make that a required question. Perfect. Now I know when I look back at my data, I will know that this is for student A quarter 1, and the data for week 1, week 2, week 3, I can pick which week. Okay, we're going to create another question. So we already know this is for one specific student. We already know that there is, we can pick what week we're recording data for. And now I'm going to say, so student A will arrive to class on time in 4 out of 5 instances. Okay. Now, again, if it's a junior high student, there's more than 4 class periods in a week. So we could look at, 40 out of 5. We can kind of decide how we want to word this, right? So that's our goal. Now, this is going to be kind of messy, right? This is kind of harder for me to tell. So I'm going to go ahead now and click on the 3 dots. And I'm going to click on Show Description. Now, this gives me the place to write the question to myself. So student A will arrive to class on 4 out of 5 instances. I'm going to make this easier. How often or how many days this week did student A get to class on time? Okay, so now when we see our data at the end, this first part's going to show up. Our helping text won't. So in our graphs, in our spreadsheet, this will show up, this won't. So it's going to make life a little bit easier, right? So now I'm going to say, okay, how many days this week did student A to get to class on time? Well, it may be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So now we know how many days this week did student A to get to class on time. So once a week, I can go in, I can say how many days that week they did. I'm also going to make this a required question. Now we're going to do one more. I said the second IEP goal was participation, something about participation. So let's say student A will participate, increase their rate of participation in class by responding to a question when asked in, we're going to go with 4 out of 5. Again, I don't know. I'm really kind of guessing this. 4 out of 5 instances. Okay. So again, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my helping. So my description, and I'm going to say, how many times did student A respond to a question when I asked it? Okay. And again, now I'm going to say 0 times, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And now again, if this is how you're going to do it, you need to make sure that every day you are at least asking them, you're asking them that one question. So maybe you're asking them something about science class, you're asking something about English class. Absolutely. So Megan just asked if I could share one with a percentage. Absolutely. So let me go ahead here. So I need to come up with another topic. Let's say student A, because we're still talking about the same student here. We'll say remaining in their seat. Still kind of going with the behavioral stuff here because that's what we're working on this example. So student A will remain in their assigned location 40% of the time when in the regular education classroom. Okay, so we have 40%, but here's the deal. That doesn't work really easily number-wise. At the end of the week, when I am kind of fried and it's Friday and I'm trying to get this data in, if I know that the student was in their assigned location, so maybe we broke up the class period into 15-minute increments or 10-minute increments. We have to figure out how we're going to break this up, right? So maybe the student, this would probably be better worded. This is a really bad example because as I'm thinking this through, I'm realizing that remaining in their assigned location would be much better to reword than my target would be how many times did they leave their assigned location, right? And that's going to be harder with percentage. So be aware this is a very bad example. Okay, we're going to go with that, but I'm going to continue with the 40% just to show how we can kind of do this with our helping text. So description then would be how many times did student A leave their location each period. And I'm going to say that I've split it into I've split the period into 4. So maybe it's a hour-long period. I'm going to do every 15 minutes. Did they stay in their assigned location that many times, right? So every 15 minutes, were they in their assigned location? Yes or no? Did they leave it? Yep. And that 15 minutes they did. That 15 minutes they didn't. That 15 minutes they didn't. Okay. Now I'm not going to necessarily give myself a percentage as the answer because it's going to be really difficult, right? It's going to be very difficult for me when I'm in a hurry to try to keep track of that percentage. So I simply can go ahead then and say things like, how many times did they leave their location each period? Okay, so then over the course of a week, because I'm doing this weekly, say it's 4 times 5, so it's going to be out of 20. because there's each period is broken into 4 and there's 5 days in the week. So I'm going to do it out of 20. So they left their thing 0 out of 20 times, 1 out of 20 times, 2 out of 20 times, etc. Right? Then I can also put the percentage behind that, right? So this week it was 0%. Next week it was this percent. So I can still include the percentage in my answers, but typically I'm going to also give myself a more concrete question. So even though, again, you may want to, use the percentages in your questions, be aware though, when you're trying to collect that data, it's going to be harder for you because you're not going to want to sit with a calculator and figure out the percentage before you fill out the form. So go back and do the math in your head before you create this form and give yourself some cue that's not percentage based when you're answering it. Okay, Megan, did that help? I hope. I understand that was a really bad example, but it was on the fly and it's where my brain went. Once your questions are all completed, you've required the ones that you want done. You are then going to go ahead and you need to do your demo, right? Because maybe this is going to give the data we want. Maybe it's not. We might need to tweak some things. So I'm going to go into Send, and I'm going to get this form in a place that I can keep track of it. So in my example earlier, I said that I had educational assistants that were filling out the form, and they were filling it out multiple times. I also said in one example that I was filling out this form multiple times. Well, if I email this to myself, I'm going to lose it. I'm fully aware if I email this to myself and it's just sitting in my email, it's going to get buried. The nice thing is that Google Forms also allows you to simply collect a link. So if I take this link, I can save this link then on a Google Doc. I can save this link on my desktop. I can also save this link onto a mobile device, okay, an iPad if you're wandering around the building with an iPad in your hand. If your district allows cell phones, you can save this form to any of those with this link. One thing I know people do is they'll just create like a Google Doc and they'll say, data collection, and they'll say, student A's form and put the link. And then at the end of the week, they can just click down them to fill these forms out. Okay. So I'm going to copy this link. We're going to go ahead and go to the fill outable version of it. And now this is what it's going to look like for a tired me at the end of the week. So, okay, it's week 1, student A. How many times did student A get to class on time? Twice. Student A will increase the rate of participation. How many times did student A to respond? Okay, she actually responded 3 times this week. This was my example one, so I'm going to ignore that one. I'm going to submit it. Okay, for tracking purposes, we need to do this again. Week 2, student got to class on time 3 times, 3, and we're going to do at least 1. I usually suggest at least 3 dummy responses. Week 3, the student got to class on time 3, 2, submit. And now I'm going to go back to my form. So I've put in some dummy data, okay, just to kind of try it out. And now I can look and I can see I've had 3 responses. Here is my data. So I really don't need this one, right? I should be filling it out once a week. So that's kind of not super useful. Student A will arrive to class on time in 4 out of 5 instances. Well, 66% of the time, they only got there 3 out of 5, and 33% of the time, they only got there 2 out of 5. So have they met this goal? Not yet. Are they making progress? Well, they're getting to the 3 out of 5. So we're making progress. And if I compared this graph for quarter 1 to quarter 2, I would expect to see that it's getting closer, right? Student A will increase the rate of participation in class. So this form looks like it's working. It's showing me the data that I want. Megan, you just had a question. Are you able to look at the data for each week? Yes. So you have your responses here as a summary, but I can go ahead and look at individual and see, okay, this was week 1. This is what it looked like. Week 2, this is what week 2 looked like. Week 3, and we'll also show you in Forms in just a minute, or Google Sheets. Okay, so now that I've done that, I've kind of done my trial. Before you go ahead and actually use it, you need to get rid of your fake responses, right? So I'm going to go here. They moved this from time to time. Now I'm not going to be able to find it. Watch, because this is my moment. Okay, there is a spot to delete all of your answers, and Oh, there we go. Okay, so under responses, you're going to go to delete all responses. And now it's going to get you back to 0. So now you're actually ready to use this with a student. What's great is once you've done this for one student, I can now go ahead and make a copy of this, and it will already have the week. It will already have some of the formatting in. So it's easier to make it for subsequent students once you have one that's formatted kind of the same. Now, again, you'd have to obviously change the goals and the numbers, but you'll already have some of your questions and things already in place. The second thing that I wanted to show here is if I go in to create a spreadsheet. So once I had my results in, and of course I deleted them before I did this. So I'm going to put a couple more examples in here real quick because I do want to take you into sheets before we are done. I'm going to go into 2. I'm just, again, literally putting in some fake data here just so we have some to work with. Oh, I jumped into week 7. That's going to make it look funny. Okay. So now that I have some data, I can go in to responses, and there's a button here that says create spreadsheet. When I click this, it's going to let me name my sheet and go into create. This is going to open up my data into Google Sheets. So now this is going to look a little bit different. So this is where also, Megan, when you said, can you look at data for each week? If you're wanting to see that, you can also see it here. So this week, week 1, they arrived to class on time. They participated 3 out of 5 times. So my data is solidly here. Now, I want to look at this a little bit for a minute too, because this can be really hard to look at. So there's a couple of things I want to show you. The first one is if there's a column you don't need, like maybe, for example, I don't need to know when it was submitted. You can click the little drop-down arrow and you can hide the column. Now that column is gone. It's still here. I can click in the little arrow and find it, but it's off my screen, out of my way. I don't need to see it anymore. I'm going to hide this column as well. So now my data is a little bit clearer. As I start going down, you're going to see there's tons of information. So maybe I've done this every day, right, for a quarter. Maybe at the end of the day, I collect data instead of the end of the week. It can be really hard to start tracking this across. So I'm going to click in the corner to highlight. I'm going to go to Format, and I'm going to click on Alternating Colors. Now I can come over here and make it all pretty and pick different colors if I want. But this is a really easy way to make your sheet easier to read. So if you are sharing screenshots of this or parts of this with a team, it's much easier to say, okay, take a look at week 3, if they can look across and see everything. The other thing that you can do is go ahead and conditionally format. So maybe you want to see every time that the student got a 3, because that's our goal, right? I'm going to highlight the columns that the data that I want to work with. You can also go into, format and conditional formatting. Now I can go over here and I can say what I'm looking for. So I can format the cells if they're not empty. That really doesn't tell me much. But I can also say if the text contains the number 3, I want it to turn green because, oh, not the text green. I want the box to turn green. Because that's going to tell me that student met the goal that day. It really wasn't. It was 4. I'm aware of that. But so now I can see at a glance, where did the student meet the goals? How often and when is that showing up? So in Google Sheets, I want you to be aware that you can hide columns to make it easier. You can go ahead and conditional format so that things will kind of show up and brighten up at you when they're hitting certain goals or when they're super low. And also that you can go into format and you can do alternating colors to visually make it easier to see. So a couple of last tips on Google Sheets is make sure that you can hide those rows, that you can alternate your rows. You can use simple formulas like column, A2 plus B2 equals if you need to do some addition. Okay, some of those things are there. So before we leave, I want to just kind of let you know that systems will change over time. Be willing to change. So if you're using a form and it's just not giving you the data you want, you're just not able to keep up with the number of times you said you'd collect it every day, it's just not working and you need to switch to a week, do it. Be willing to change. Develop a routine and don't overcomplicate things. Move the paperclip from one pocket to the other. Use your checklist. Make life easy for yourself. And once you've done that, take the time to use the data you collect. Walk into a meeting with the data, being able to say, student A has participated in class this many times, because you can say that confidently if you've collected the data. I did see Erica said in chat, I'm starting to use Google Forms and Sheets for my data, using QR codes for my para to be able to scan it to get into the form. I love it. All my students have 6 or more sets of goals. That is beautiful. It is going to take some time to get them all set up, but it will save you a lot of time in the end. Also, before we wrap up here, Lori asked, are you able to graph data with Google Sheets? You can. So if I come in here and highlight these, okay, highlight what I want to graph, I can then go into tools. I believe it's tools. Where am I lost now? Oh, there we go. Sorry. Insert. I've been working with some new programs lately and my brain's a little fried. So if I go into insert and chart, it will then go ahead and create a chart for me. You may need to go ahead and change the type of chart that you want, or change which data is on which axis in order to get the chart to look the way you want. But yes, you absolutely can. You're simply going to highlight the data and insert a chart. Once you've done that, this menu will open up for you and you can go ahead and kind of customize it based off of what you are looking for. But yes, it will graph it for you. So Google Forms, you get kind of their standard. Okay, this is quick and easy and simple, but if you want to kind of customize or create things differently, then you can go in here and do that highlighting and creating the form in here. Okay, I do know that we're at time. I do want to honor everybody's time. I know that everybody is super, super, super busy. I will share this presentation with Deb with the additional slides included in it, as well as the link to a copy of the discrepancy analysis that you can edit. Just please keep the recognition on the bottom that it was borrowed and edited from the previous district as well, so they get credit for that. If you have any other questions, definitely I'm here, or you can reach out to me as well.
All right, I think that ends our presentation for today. Thanks so much for all of the great information, Cassie, and I will get the updated presentation out in the email tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.